Hello, thanks for joining me for the last part of this chapter. We will finish off our discussion on meiosis by looking at what happens when something goes wrong with this process, and in particular, what happens if you end up with a wrong number of chromosomes. Remember, karyotype was a tool that we used to visualize and line up all chromosome pairs in an order based on their size. And it really is one very useful tool for us when doing initial screenings for any genetic disorders that are related to a wrong number or shape of chromosomes. We use these for a few purposes. We look if there are extra or missing chromosomes, as these can have either big or small consequences in problems with growth, development, function, and so on. We also look for abnormal shape or size of chromosomes. And of course, we can use these to find out the sex of an individual. At this point, I do want to highlight something that is really outside the scope of your textbook, but I really think that this is an important thing for you to be aware of. And I'm quite passionate about my students getting this right because a lot of my research in biomedicine has focused on this, and this will be so important for you to be clear when you go into clinical practice. Sex and gender are really different terms. In terms of biology, we talk about sex. And that is what your genetic basis defines you as. You cannot change it. That is just whether your DNA makes you biologically a female or male. Gender instead is about what you identify as. And the reason why this is very important for us is that you cannot change your biological sex on a cellular level. We cannot go to the DNA and alter that if one goes through a gender realignment surgery. And I actually used to work for a gender reassignment clinic, and I have some good cases to discuss about it. But for our purposes, the reason why this is so important in medical field is that you cannot change that. For example, this paper of mine looks at heart tissue and its behavior in MRI. And it is not unusual for me to get patients who have had their gender reassigned. And that will not change how their heart muscle works on a cellular level. And if I would be talking about gender differences, I would probably get very confusing results, whereas sex is really what we are looking at in this case. And yes, you do need to be a little sensitive about how you approach these things in a clinical practice, but you should also be, at least in your head and in the way you record your notes, very clear of this difference. But really, this is more of a side note that I wanted to mention. So if you think about this process of producing sex cells, our sperm and egg cells, it is really quite a complicated process, and it is twice of the phases of that of mitosis. And occasionally mistakes happen with mitosis too. So I think it's quite remarkable that we get so little mistakes in the process of meiosis and making new human beings. But let's have a look at some examples of cases where this goes wrong and what is the outcome. And I am sure that I do not have a problem with you, but I always say this in my face-to-face classes too, so I'm going to mention it to you as well. We are not looking at these pictures to have a giggle or anything like that. We are looking at them to learn, so we will treat the access to these pictures with an according respect. The other thing that I do want to say is that many of these pictures are clinical case photos, so I expect that you will treat them accordingly and will not share them. They are used only for this purpose at this course, at this module. Okay, let's have a look at some examples when things go wrong. So let's look at this first case that we have here. When studying the karyotype, what do you notice as being abnormal? Yes, there is only one sex chromosome, and that is X. So that makes an individual technically female. as her chromosome 23 would be XO. So this would result in a Turner syndrome. Some characteristic features associated with this condition, which we can see also here, are low set of ears, wide neck, broad chest, which we call shield chest, and typically short fingers. These structural characteristics have some consequences also for body's features. For example, arms typically turn outward at the level of elbow, and the eyelids appear drooping, and so on. Not surprisingly, these individuals are typically infertile since the ovaries are not going to develop. There is also a quite high likelihood of heart defects. In fact, about 50% of individuals with Turner syndrome face this. Other typical delays and dysfunctions involve issues with language and motor skills. And of course, these all have then consequently an effect on the quality of life of an individual. And I think that this is always quite an important point to keep in mind for anyone going into clinical field. It is not just the symptoms that we must be thinking, but the effects of those symptoms on the quality of individual's life. So anxiety, shyness, and low self-esteem are quite typical with this condition. And one thing that we find in addition is that we expect a shorter lifespan for these individuals. Well, for this next one, try to identify from the karyotype what's off here. And if you study it with great care, you will probably notice that there are 2 X chromosomes and 1 Y chromosome. So technically this does make this individual a male. And this is called Klinefelter syndrome. And some physical characteristics that we typically find are that these individuals are typically tall and the build is really quite non-muscular. You can also see here characteristic broad hips and long legs. And the breast is large. There is some development there. Well, what other consequences do we find here? These individuals have typically weak bones and low energy levels, and often the puberty is delayed too. Another typical characteristic that we see here is that there is little or no body hair. I think that the next one is quite interesting as well. You will probably notice immediately from the karyotype that there are 3 X chromosomes present. Well, this is called Pollo X, and it can actually be the case that there are even more than 3 X chromosomes. These individuals are often autistic or on the autistic spectrum, and typically their behavior is characterized by hyperactivity. There are speech defects and mental retardation often too, but really the physical symptoms can vary a lot. Or it may even be that none are seen. I have some more that we could look at, so let's check out this one. So what do we see? Well, we will notice that there are 1 X chromosome and 2 Y chromosomes. So that results in a condition known as Jacob's syndrome. And this is characterized by a tall build and often persistent acne. Also, there are often speech and reading problems. These individuals are typically also sterile. Okay. You will find sometimes some feminine characteristics such as breast development and lack of body hair as well. Okay, here is one that is usually fairly well-known one. So what do we see here? The ones that pay close attention can notice that there are 3 chromosome 21s. And of course, we know that that results in Down syndrome. So what do we see? We see often decreased muscle tone at birth and even later this excess skin at neck. The facial features really are characterized by a flat nose, upward slanting eyes, and small and low ears and mouth. For the body features, you will notice wide and short hands and short fingers. Also, the joints of the skull are often separated. And just in general, I think that the flat face is a very characteristic feature. Well, this next one is a little bit more challenging one to spot, so let's see if you can do that. If you pay close attention, you may be able to see that part of chromosome 7 is missing. And this results in Williams syndrome. Well, some characteristic problems with these individuals are dental problems and kidney problems. We find that they are often have a rather sensitive hearing. In terms of behavior, a lot of the time individuals with Williams syndrome come across as excessively friendly. And there are often disordered facial features. Another thing that is quite common is hernia problems. And since we had these issues with the mouth region and onward, also eating can be troublesome. One characteristic neonatal feature, a low birth weight and low weight gain. There are often mild retardation and respiratory problems are common too. Well, this is the second last one that I have listed for you here, and it has a rather descriptive name, but let's start by identifying what is going on here. If you pay close attention, you might notice that there is a deletion at chromosome 5. And this results in Karyotype syndrome. Actually, I believe that this is French and stands for a cry of a cat. And that really is quite a good description of the sound that these individuals make. Some features that you might notice are small head and the head being, in general, quite unusually round. We find that they have small chin, eyes are typically far apart, and there is extra skin over the eyes. Also, the nose bridge is rather small. So some consequences to day-to-day living might be difficulties with walking and talking, and also behavioral problems, in particular hyperactivity and aggression. And of course, we do have often mental retardation with this condition. The last one that I want to introduce is actually a rather interesting one. When parts of chromosomes 2 and 20 are changed, we end up with Alagille syndrome. And what we have here is especially facial and eye features that are distinctive. And also typically issues with internal organs. And an interesting one, often severe itching as well. Well, I hope that you have found some of these interesting. Often students seem to do so. And although your textbook does not include all of these, now that we have gone through them, they are up for grabs also in the quiz. I think that this is a good time for us to stop on this chapter for now, and I will see you soon again.